It was the knocking that woke me. Soft at first, like someone tapping politely. I remember staring at the ceiling in that groggy confusion you get when your brain isn't ready to join your body yet. It came again. Tap. 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 I turned toward the sound instinctively, eyes darting to the window beside my bed. That's when the confusion sharpened into something closer to dread. My bedroom was on the second floor. I sat up slowly, the covers sliding down as I strained to listen, my heart pounding harder with each beat. The noise had stopped, and the room seemed too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, the night was still, a deep, inky black that the faint glow of the moon couldn't fully break. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it. Then I saw it. A square of pale paper was stuck to the glass. It fluttered slightly, as if caught in a weak breeze that I couldn't feel. My pulse surged as I leaned forward to get a better look, and the instant I recognized the shape on the paper, it felt like my stomach dropped straight through the bed. It was a photograph. The angle was odd but unmistakable. It was me, in this very bed, taken just minutes before. My face was slack with sleep, the blanket pulled up to my chin. I was staring at a picture of myself, taken from where I now sat right here, on the edge of my mattress. I froze. My brain kept trying to make sense of it, and failing, fumbling for some reasonable explanation. I scanned the yard below, but all I could see were shadows. The grass stretched out flat and dark, a patch of faint light spilling from my window and illuminating nothing at all. No ladder, no person, just emptiness. The photo was stuck to the outside of the window. That detail gnawed at me. The only way someone could have gotten it there was by leaning over a sheer drop. I'd seen enough horror movies to know better than to fling the window open to grab it. I needed to think. I turned toward the nightstand and reached for it with shaking hands. It was just after 3 a.m. I hovered over the call icon, thumb ready to punch in 911, when I paused. What would I even say? Someone taped a photo of me sleeping to my second-story window, but there's no sign of them now. It sounded insane. Instead, I turned on the flashlight app and aimed it at the window, sweeping the beam across the yard. I flinched at every twitch of a branch or shifting shadow, half expecting to see someone staring up at me, but there was nothing. The beam only caught empty grass and the glint of the fence that bordered the far edge of the property. After what felt like minutes, I let out a shaky breath and turned off the light. My mind had started racing in 100 frantic directions, but one thought broke through the noise. I needed to get rid of the photo. I couldn't just sit here with it watching me. I stood carefully, as if sudden movement might provoke something unseen outside. The floor creaked under my weight, making me wince. When I reached the window, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. I could see the edge of the paper better now, slightly crinkled from the wind but pressed flat enough to cling to the glass. I told myself to be quick, just to snatch it and shut the window again. I unlatched it and slid the pane up. Cold air poured in, sharper than I'd expected. It made my breath come out in a shiver as I leaned out just enough to grab the paper. My fingers fumbled against it, and for one terrible moment, I imagined a hand lunging from below to grab my wrist. Nothing happened. I peeled the photograph free and slammed the window shut so fast the glass rattled in its frame. Stepping back into the room, I stared down at the photo in my hand. It was printed on cheap glossy paper, the kind you'd find at any drugstore. There were no markings or words, no signs of who might have taken it. Just me, in this bed. That was enough. I didn't want it. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and shoved the photo inside, pushing it down beneath a mess of old receipts and junk. I slammed the drawer shut and stood there for a second, breathing hard, as if I'd buried something alive and needed to keep it down. I told myself it was over, that whoever had done it was probably just some asshole playing a prank. Maybe a drone, I thought suddenly. A drone with a camera. That would explain the angle, right? Someone nearby could have sent one up and hovered it outside my window. It was still creepy, but it wasn't impossible. I went back to bed, pulling the blankets tighter around me like they'd protect me somehow. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made my eyes snap open again, every creak of the house reminding me I wasn't alone, not really. But no one knocked again. By morning it almost felt like it hadn't happened. Sunlight poured through the window, and everything looked so normal that I wondered if maybe I'd dreamt it. But the weight in my nightstand drawer said otherwise. I didn't look at the photo again. I didn't want to. Instead, I went about my day, trying to shake the lingering unease. I made coffee. I checked emails. I scrolled through social media as if normalcy could erase the night before. I even convinced myself to check the yard for any sign of someone being there, footprints, dropped objects, but the grass was untouched, pristine. By the time the sun went down again, I felt almost stupid for how scared I'd been. Pranks like that only worked if you let them. At least that's what I thought. The knocking started again just after midnight. This time it was louder. I bolted upright, dread pooling in my stomach like cold lead. The sound was slow and deliberate, a series of 3 knocks spaced far enough apart that each one echoed faintly through the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. From where I sat, I could see the window clearly, though I didn't want to. My eyes locked on the glass, wide and unblinking. There was something taped there again, flapping slightly in a breeze that shouldn't have been able to reach it. I stared at it for what felt like forever, hoping it would vanish if I stayed still enough. When it didn't, I felt something heavy and cold crawl up my spine. I slid my feet to the floor and stood slowly, as though the thing outside might hear me. My legs felt weak as I approached the window. I could see the edge of another photograph, pale and crooked against the glass. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to touch it. But I had to. My hands shook as I unlatched the window. The moment the glass lifted, that same icy air rushed in, colder than it should have been. I snatched the photo and shut the window again so fast that I barely registered the paper crinkling in my hand. My chest felt tight as I forced myself to look at it. It was me again. This time the angle was lower, as though whoever took it had been crouching at the foot of my bed. My face was turned slightly toward the camera, and I felt my stomach twist when I realized that my eyes were half open. Not fully, just a sliver of white beneath the lids. It looked wrong. Like I had been trying to wake up. My fingers went numb as I stared at the photograph. I couldn't pull my eyes away from it. It wasn't just the image of myself that unsettled me, it was the feeling that I recognized something about the photo. Not the angle, not the composition, but something beneath it, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. A scraping noise suddenly cut through the room. I flinched so hard the photo slipped from my hand. The sound had come from the window. My gaze snapped toward it. The glass looked the same as before, dark and still, but I swore I saw something shift at the very bottom edge, just the faintest blur of movement, like fingertips brushing against the pane before disappearing. I froze, heart pounding so violently it hurt. I strained my ears, desperate to hear. Well, anything. There was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the house settling, my breathing shallow and ragged. I didn't approach the window this time. I couldn't. Instead, I picked up the photograph where it had landed face down on the carpet and shoved it into the nightstand with the first one. I didn't look at either of them again. My hands trembled as I slammed the drawer shut, pressing it closed with more force than necessary. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in bed with my back against the headboard, staring at the window like I expected it to crack open at any moment. I turned every light in the room on, though it didn't help much. Light couldn't do anything about the creeping paranoia digging its claws into my brain. I told myself I'd call someone in the morning, anyone, and figure this out. Maybe the police. Maybe someone who could explain how a person gets a photo of you through a window they can't possibly reach. I don't know. Te bitch faces. When the first light of dawn spilled across the walls, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I hadn't moved from my spot all night, and my body ached from staying so rigid, but I didn't care. It was morning. I was still here. I grabbed my phone and immediately began dialing the non-emergency line. My thumb hovered over the call icon just as I realized something I didn't actually know what I was going to say. I had 2 photographs of myself sleeping, yes, but no sign of how they'd gotten there. No footprints. No ladder marks. No signs of entry. Whoever was doing this had been careful. Too careful. What if the police didn't take me seriously? Worse, what if they did and still couldn't do anything about it? I didn't call. Instead, I showered, got dressed, and left the house without even making coffee. I needed to get out of there, away from that room, away from the window. I told myself I'd run errands, find a place to sit for a while, maybe a coffee shop where the noise and life would pull me back into reality. The first couple of hours were fine. Normal, even. I drove with the windows down, the cool morning air refreshing against my face, as if the events of the night could blow away like dust. I picked up groceries, browsed shelves I didn't care about, lingered over shelves of toothpaste and snacks I didn't need. I wasn't in any rush to go home. But the longer I stayed out, the worse the unease got. It was like an itch at the back of my mind, a pull I couldn't ignore. I kept thinking about the window, about the photographs sitting in my nightstand. Something about them felt unfinished, unresolved. I finally caved and headed back around noon, telling myself it was fine. It had been a prank, nothing more. Someone had their fun, and they wouldn't come back. It would be over. But as I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. The curtains in my bedroom window were open. I knew for a fact I'd left them shut. The cold weight in my chest returned, heavier than ever. I sat there in the car, staring up at the window, at the gap in the curtains, half expecting to see someone's face staring back. But there was nothing. I forced myself to get out of the car, my legs shaking as I climbed the steps to the front door. I paused with the key halfway in the lock, listening. The house was silent, too silent. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Shoes by the door, keys on the entry table. Groceries still in hand, I moved toward the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing against my ears like cotton. When I reached the hallway that led to my bedroom, I stopped. The door was open. I always shut my bedroom door. Always. The hairs on my neck rose as I stood there, staring at the dark crack leading into the room. My fingers tightened around the grocery bag, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet. I took a step closer. The smell hit me then. It was faint but sharp, like something metallic. I knew it immediately: blood. I didn't want to keep walking, but my body moved forward anyway, drawn by some awful compulsion to know. The floor creaked as I pushed the door open the rest of the way. My bedroom looked the same at first glance. The bed was still unmade, the curtains still half drawn. But then I noticed the window. The glass was streaked with red. Handprints. They weren't clear, like someone had pressed their palms perfectly against the pane. These were smudged, uneven, as though whoever had made them had been struggling. They started low, near the bottom edge of the window, and dragged upward, fingers splayed, until they faded out near the top. The blood wasn't fresh, but it hadn't completely dried either. I could see how the sunlight reflected dully off the streaks. I stepped back into the hallway, bile rising in my throat. I didn't understand. How had someone gotten up there? There was no way. It was no possible. I stumbled back to the living room and sank onto the couch, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay here. I wouldn't stay here. Whoever this was, whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, something caught my eye. There was a slip of white sticking out from the corner of the coffee table, like someone had tucked it there for me to find. My fingers felt numb as I reached for it, already knowing what it was. Another photograph. This one was taken during the day, from outside the house. It showed me sitting on the couch just moments earlier, staring at my phone. My vision blurred as I stared at the photograph in my trembling hands. It was me. It was right now. Same clothes, same position, same room. Someone had been outside while I sat here, completely unaware. I scrambled up from the couch and spun toward the windows. My heart thumped so violently I could hear it in my ears, a dull roar that blocked out everything else. The blinds were drawn. I stood there, frozen, caught in a frantic cycle of do I look or don't I? My body didn't want to move, but my brain screamed that I had to know. I had to look. I stepped closer to the nearest window, moving slowly, like I was wading through water. The blinds felt thin and flimsy between my fingers as I gripped one slat and pulled it down just far enough to peek outside. The yard was empty. I exhaled, half relieved, but my hand still wouldn't let go of the blind. Something didn't feel right. I scanned the grass, the fence line, the trees swaying gently in the distance. My eyes kept getting drawn to the corner of the house, where a narrow space led around to the backyard, an angle I couldn't quite see. I let the blind snap back into place and backed away from the window. My knees felt weak, as though I'd been running for miles. Whoever this was, they were close enough to photograph me through the window, and I hadn't heard anything. Not a footstep. Not a creak. I grabbed my keys and phone from the table and rushed for the front door. I didn't even care where I'd go, I just couldn't be here anymore. Not with them. The moment I stepped outside, I regretted it. The air was dead still. No wind, no rustling, no sound at all. Even the birds seemed to have vanished, leaving the world unnervingly silent. I crept down the porch steps, scanning the yard, the trees, the narrow space alongside the house that I couldn't see from the window. Nothing. I forced my legs to keep moving, one shaky step at a time, until I reached my car. The sound of the door unlocking felt obscenely loud in the quiet, and when I climbed inside and locked the doors again, I finally exhaled. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, staring at the house through the windshield. Every curtain was shut now, like empty eyes turned inward. It hit me then, what if they're already inside? I didn't want to think it, but I couldn't help myself. Whoever this was had been in my yard. They'd left photographs on my window, in my living room. What was stopping them from going even further? I turned the ignition. The car roared to life, and I tore out of the driveway so fast that the tires screeched against the pavement. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving for hours. I stuck to main roads and highways, anything with people around. I pulled into a gas station when the sun dipped low on the horizon, and just sat in my car for a while, staring blankly at the dashboard. Everything felt surreal. The photos, the handprints on the window, the smudged red that shouldn't have been possible. I couldn't make sense of it. I kept telling myself it was some elaborate prank, but the thought felt hollow, like I didn't even believe it anymore. When night fell, I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. It was one of those run-down places where the sign buzzes and half the letters are burned out. But the parking lot was full, and I figured it was better to be surrounded by people, no matter how sketchy, than alone. The room itself was small and grimy, the kind of place where the carpet never quite feels clean underfoot. I threw my bag on the bed and turned on every light. I even pushed the rickety dresser in front of the window. Still, I couldn't relax. My body refused to let me. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself with news or videos or anything that didn't feel like a reminder of what had happened. A notification buzzed. It was an image. No sender name, no text, just the image. I felt my throat close up as I opened it. It was a photograph of my motel room. The picture was taken from the parking lot, looking directly at the narrow space between the blinds where I'd failed to close them fully. I could see myself sitting on the bed, hunched over my phone, exactly as I was now. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, the screen still glowing faintly on the floor. I spun toward the window. The blinds were still down, though the thin slats left narrow gaps. I stood and crept closer, dread curdling inside me like poison. My fingers twitched as I slowly parted the blinds, just enough to look through. The parking lot was empty. At least it looked empty. I scanned the rows of parked cars, the unlit spaces beyond the buzzing neon sign. Then my eyes caught something at the very edge of the lot, near the tree line. A figure. I couldn't see them clearly, just a dark shape, standing too still to be natural. It was facing the motel, but I couldn't make out any details. My chest tightened as I let the blinds fall shut again and backed away from the window. My phone buzzed again. Another image. My hands shook as I picked it up. This time, the photo was taken from inside the motel room. It showed me standing at the window, looking out through the blinds. I dropped the phone again, my entire body breaking into a cold sweat. I turned back toward the door, checking the lock, the flimsy chain hanging uselessly against the wood. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud I could barely think. How had they gotten in? The room felt smaller now, the shadows in the corners darker, like something could be crouched just out of view. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on the door. On the bathroom door. It was coming from inside the room. The knocks were slow, impossibly deliberate, 3 dull thuds that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up my legs. I stood there, frozen, staring at the bathroom door like it might suddenly burst open. It didn't move. Nothing happened. But the sound of my heartbeat filled the silence, so loud it felt like it might drown me. I don't know how long I stood there. My body was rigid, locked between fight and flight, unsure which would keep me alive. The bathroom door was closed, I knew that much, but something about it seemed different now. Wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. My phone buzzed from where it had landed on the floor. The vibration jolted me out of my paralysis, and I stumbled toward it, fumbling as I snatched it up. There was a new image. It was the bathroom door, photographed from inside the motel room. The picture was almost identical to what I saw in front of me, except for one small, stomach-turning detail. At the bottom of the door, the faintest sliver of something dark protruded beneath the frame. A shoe. No. A boot. Whoever or whatever was in there wasn't hiding anymore. I felt a wave of cold sweat break over my body. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I backed away, my gaze never leaving the bottom edge of the bathroom door. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like I was trapped underwater. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my breathing. My phone was still in my hand, and I forced myself to look at it again. Maybe there was anything that would tell me what to do. But before I could open the message thread, the screen lit up with an incoming call. No caller ID. The phone vibrated against my palm and I stood there, staring at it, feeling sick. I didn't want to answer it. I knew I shouldn't answer it, but I couldn't stop my thumb from swiping across the screen. I lifted the phone to my ear with shaking hands. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Breathing. It was slow and wet, a sound so close to the receiver that it felt like it was inside my head. I pulled the phone away from my ear, almost dropping it, but the line stayed open. That breathing continued, ragged and deliberate, louder than anything I'd ever heard. I couldn't take it. I hung up, the call cutting off abruptly. My hands trembled as I stared at the phone. My chest felt tight, the air around me thick and suffocating. Get out, I thought. I have to get out. The bathroom door knocked again. 3 knocks. I screamed. I couldn't help it. I screamed until my throat felt raw, the sound echoing through the small room. I stumbled for the door to the hallway, yanking at the lock with shaking hands, fumbling at the chain until it slid free. Behind me, the bathroom door creaked just slightly, just enough. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I flung the motel door open and ran. The night air hit me like ice, burning my lungs as I sprinted across the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached the road. My feet pounded against the pavement, and I realized I wasn't holding my phone anymore. I must have dropped it back in the room. It didn't matter. I just had to keep moving. I didn't know where I was running to. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. At some point I heard the sound of an engine approaching, headlights sweeping over me. A car slowed as it neared, and I stumbled toward it, waving my arms. The driver was a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He rolled the window down, frowning. "Hey, are you okay?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I was shaking too hard, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The man's frown deepened. "You need a ride. You don't look so good." I nodded. I didn't care who he was. I just needed to get away. He unlocked the passenger door, and I climbed in, my body feeling disconnected and numb. "Where to?" he asked, his voice cautious. I didn't even know how to answer, just away, far away. The man gave me a strange look but nodded and pulled back onto the road. I sank into the seat, staring out the window, the darkness rushing past in a blur. For the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of relief. "You staying at that motel?" the man asked suddenly. I looked at him sharply. "What?" "The place back there. Looked like you were running from something." He glanced at me, waiting for an answer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yeah. Something happened." He nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "Motel's a weird place. Had a friend stay there once. Said he didn't like the windows." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged, said they felt wrong, like someone was watching. "You know how it is places like that, you never know who's been there before you." I stared at him, unable to respond. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. We drove in silence for a while after that, the road stretching out endlessly before us. I tried to calm myself, to focus on the rhythm of the tires against the pavement. I didn't know where we were going, but it didn't matter. I just had to get far away from that motel, far away from the thing in the bathroom. But then I saw it. The man's phone was mounted on the dashboard, the screen facing me. A faint glow illuminated the edges of the car, and I couldn't help but look. It was open to a photo. I leaned forward slowly, my chest tightening. It was me, sitting in the passenger seat of his car. The picture had been taken just moments earlier. My blood ran cold. I turned to look at the man, my breath catching in my throat. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not a comforting one. It was wide, too wide. He didn't say anything. He just gripped the wheel tighter and pressed his foot down on the gas. The car sped up, the trees outside blurring into dark streaks. I reached for the door handle, yanking at it, but it wouldn't open. The man's smile grew wider, stretching across his face like a tear. "You shouldn't have run," he said softly. The last thing I saw before the car plunged into the dark was his reflection in the rearview mirror. There were no eyes, just empty, black sockets staring back. The car plunged forward, gaining speed, the engine roaring like a wild animal. My screams tangled with the sound, ripping through the cabin as I yanked uselessly at the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The window wouldn't move either. I slammed my fists against the glass, my panicked reflection staring back at me, a pale, open-mouthed face I barely recognized. "Let me out," I shrieked, my voice cracking. The man didn't respond. His hands were locked onto the steering wheel, white-knuckled, his expression frozen in that grotesque smile. I could see the deep hollows where his eyes should have been, dark and empty, like someone had scooped them out. But somehow I knew he was looking at me, watching me. The car swerved. My body was thrown against the door as the tires screeched, the vehicle veering off the road. The headlights cut through the darkness in jerky, uneven arcs, sweeping over trees and empty fields. He wasn't driving on the road anymore, he was driving toward the woods. I clawed at the seatbelt, my fingers fumbling until I found the release button. It popped open, the belt snapping free. The car bucked violently over uneven ground, bouncing so hard I was nearly thrown into the dashboard. My chance was now or never. I braced myself and pulled at the lock pin on the door. Somehow, it slid up this time, like the car had decided to let me go. I threw the door open. Cold air and darkness rushed in, and before I could second-guess myself, I hurled my body out into the night. The impact hit like a freight train. My shoulders slammed into the dirt, and I tumbled, the world spinning in a chaotic blur of trees and headlights. The ground scraped against my arms and face, burning like fire. I finally came to a stop, lying in a patch of wet, freezing grass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The car's engine screamed behind me, the tires digging into the earth. I heard it skid to a stop, the headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. I turned my head slowly, my body aching with every movement. The driver's side door creaked open. The man stepped out. At least it looked like the man, his silhouette tall and broad, his boots crunching on the dirt. But there was something wrong with the way he moved. His limbs jerked unnaturally, like he wasn't used to his own body. He stopped in front of the headlights, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. His smile hadn't faded. It had grown. The corners of his mouth were split wide now, stretching impossibly far, his skin torn and glistening in the harsh light. Where his eyes should have been, there was only blackness, bottomless sockets that seemed to drink in the light around them. "Why'd you jump out?" he asked softly. His voice was low, casual, as though we were two friends having a conversation. The sound of it sent icy needles down my spine. I couldn't answer. My body refused to move. I lay there, shivering, trying to focus on my breathing as his boots crunched closer. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't do anything except stare. He stopped a few feet away and tilted his head, the empty holes of his eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered. "You shouldn't have run." He crouched down, that smile still tearing across his face. His skin looked too thin, as though something was pressing against it from the inside, ready to break free. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see anymore. I didn't want to know what happened next. Then I heard it. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I opened my eyes, confused. The man was gone. The car was gone. I was lying in my bed, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me like restraints. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat up, gasping for air. It was a dream. It had to have been a dream. But then I heard the knocking again. It was coming from the window. I turned toward it, my entire body going cold. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something against the glass's shadow, standing perfectly still, waiting. I forced myself to move. I slid off the bed, my bare feet hitting the floor as I crept toward the window. I don't know why I did it. I had to see. I had to know. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain and yanked it open. There was nothing there. The yard outside was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. No footprints, no shadows, just silence. I let out a shaky breath, my head spinning. I turned away from the window and stopped cold. There was a photograph lying on my pillow. I didn't remember it being there when I woke up. I picked it up slowly, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. It was me. Lying in bed, taken just moments ago. I dropped the photograph and stumbled back, slamming into the wall. My chest heaved as I tried to think, tried to understand. I looked around the room, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, just barely, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, like a breath against my ear, but I heard it as clear as anything. "Don't look under the bed." I froze. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look. But the moment the thought entered my head, I couldn't stop it. My gaze drifted downward, toward the edge of the bed. The room seemed to stretch out around me, the shadows growing darker. Slowly, I lowered myself to the floor, my shaking hands pressing into the carpet. I leaned forward until I could see the dark gap beneath the bed. It was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But as I sat up, my eyes caught something on the ceiling above me. A face. It was pressed against the ceiling, staring down at me with empty, black sockets and a grin that stretched wider than humanly possible. And then it started to crawl toward me. It moved in quick, jerking bursts, its limbs bending at sharp, unnatural angles. The grin never faded. It just watched me, crawling along the ceiling like some grotesque spider, its empty sockets locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body felt disconnected from my mind as I sat there on the floor, staring up at it, helpless. Each movement it made sent a sickening scrape through the room, like nails dragging against wood. The sound seemed to drill into my skull, making my vision blur at the edges. Then it stopped. It hung directly above me, motionless, its face upside down, that grin stretching even wider. I could see the thin skin of its cheeks splitting at the corners, red and raw, as though it might peel away at any moment. It whispered something then, so faint that it felt like it was inside my head. "Get back in bed." I snapped out of my paralysis, stumbling backwards so fast that my shoulders slammed into the dresser. The thing on the ceiling didn't move. It just watched me. The air in the room had turned icy, each breath I took coming out in a puff of white mist. "Get back in bed." The voice came again, louder this time, harsher. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I shook my head violently, my body screaming at me to get out of the room. My eyes darted to the door, but the moment I moved, the thing dropped. It didn't fall like a person would. It hit the floor silently, landing on all fours, its limbs spread wide, its head snapping up to look at me. I could see it clearly now, grey, mottled skin pulled tight over a body that was far too thin, its grin carved into its face like a permanent wound. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, my bare feet slipping on the carpet. I heard it behind me, those sharp, jerking movements scraping closer, but I didn't dare look back. I tore the door open and ran into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The house was silent, too silent. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, my hands trembling as I gripped the doorknob, holding it shut. My heart pounded so hard it felt like my ribs might break. Then the knocking started again. 3 slow knocks. I turned my head, expecting the sound to be coming from the door I'd just fled. But it wasn't. It was coming from the window at the end of the hallway. I couldn't take this anymore. I didn't care what it was or who it was. I was done. I rushed down the hall and threw the front door open, running out into the freezing night without so much as a glance behind me. The air hit my face like ice water, but it didn't matter. I just needed to get as far away as possible. My bare feet slapped against the pavement as I ran down the street. It felt like the world was silent except for me, the sound of my breathing, my footsteps, the blood roaring in my ears. I didn't see any lights on in the other houses. No cars, no people. The street stretched out before me, endless and empty. I ran until I couldn't anymore. My legs gave out somewhere near the edge of the neighborhood, and I collapsed onto the cold asphalt, my lungs burning. I glanced back the way I'd come, expecting to see it. Expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just my house in the distance, sitting quiet and still beneath the moonlight. For a moment I thought it was over. Then my phone buzzed. I froze. I didn't remember grabbing it, but it was in my pocket, vibrating insistently against my leg. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The screen was cracked maybe from when I'd fallen, but it still worked. There was a new message. It was a photograph. I opened it with numb fingers, dread coiling in my gut. It was me, sitting on the pavement right here, right now. The picture had been taken from behind. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The street was empty. The houses were dark, but something about the silence felt alive, like I was being watched from every direction at once. I stumbled to my feet, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move. I had to keep running. But where could I go? I couldn't go home. I couldn't go to a neighbor. No one would understand. My phone buzzed again. Another photograph. It was closer this time, taken just a few feet behind me. My shoulders, the back of my head, the cracked pavement beneath me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran for. Hours, maybe. My legs ached, my feet were raw, but I didn't stop. The streets blurred into each other, and when I finally slowed down, I didn't even recognize where I was. A stretch of empty road stretched out in both directions, surrounded by nothing but trees, no houses, no cars, no lights, just darkness pressing in from every side. I sank to the ground, my body finally giving out. I sat there in the middle of the road, trembling, staring at the phone in my hand. It buzzed one last time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message was a video. My thumb hovered over it, my breath shuddering out in ragged bursts. I tapped the screen. The video was grainy and dark, but I recognized the setting immediately. It was this road, this exact spot. And then the camera moved, jerking forward like someone running until it showed me. I was sitting exactly as I was now, hunched over, staring at the phone. But in the video I wasn't alone. A figure stood behind me, just at the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted as it watched me. I could see its grin, wide and splitting its face open like a gash. The video ended. A shadow fell over me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, shaking, as the slow, deliberate knocking started again this time, against the back of my skull,